Um, I want to start with something that's really, I think, fundamental here, which is the idea that employees are our most important asset, is something that leaders often say, but many times they don't mean.
Employees are the new customers.
We have a term that we use sometimes called SLINO, and SLINO stands for servant leader in name only, because it implies that they know in some way, shape, or form that there needs to be some form of employee centricity. They've read a book on servant leadership, maybe, or they've heard the term, or something along those lines.
What is great about my employees is they're always dissatisfied, even if they seem to be happy. It's really how to improve the experience of your employees, and that isn't often not that you give them, nap pots and free snacks and free yoga classes, because nobody is being motivated by there is free snack, let's work a little harder. You can have ping pong table and a terrible work culture, and the ping pong table is not going to save. Nobody's going to stay. Oh, my boss is an asshole, but we have a ping pong table. I call it in the book purpose washing.
Yes, I love that term.
And it's similar to greenwashing, where it borrows it, and then greenwashing, being I pretend to be green, but I'm not really. And once the customer or the regulator find out, there's really a backlash. Now, within the organization, 80% of employees report talent hoarding, meaning their manager, their boss, actually doesn't want them to learn something new, because then they potentially leave.
Hi, everybody. Now, regular listeners to the pod will know that we're somewhat obsessed with the idea of what it takes to help people thrive at work and what it takes to create human-centric workplaces. We've had lots of great leaders, authors, and CEOs on the show who've given us real insights into aspects of this, but no one has ever attacked this topic completely from top to bottom until today. There is a brilliant new book out on this topic, and I thoroughly recommend it. Although I will admit I am jealous because I wish I'd written it. It's called The Employee Advantage: How Putting Workers First Helps Businesses Thrive, by Stephan Meier, who is the James P. Gorman Professor of Business Strategy and the chair of the Management Division at Columbia Business School. And I am really thrilled to say that Stephan is with me to talk about these themes today. So welcome to the podcast, Stephan.
Thank you so much, Paul. I mean, those are the nicest words I've ever heard about my book. So keep on saying those words. So I really appreciate it, especially coming from you, who actually knows the space really well. So that means extra lot for me. So thank you so much for having me and for looking forward for a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. But before we get started, though, I want to be clear. If you are a fan of this podcast, you will be a fan of Stephan's book. So go ahead and buy that. I've been researching this field for years, and I still learned a lot, particularly from a lot of the detailed examples. So go buy that book, and also subscribe to Stephan's monthly newsletter. And when you do that, you'll be able to check out his really cool stop motion videos. I've been binge watching a few of those, Stephan. We'll put links to all of those things in the show notes. All right, plugs done.
Okay.
Let's get into things. All right. I want to start with something that's really, I think, fundamental here, which is the idea that employees are our most important asset, is something that leaders often say, but many times they don't mean. We've observed this a lot in our own work. Why do you think this is the case?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I also observe it in my work. One is I actually looked at how executives talk about customers as another stakeholder and employees, and there is about a 10x difference in how often they talk about it, how the words they use about customers and what they use about the employees. Why that's the case, it's a little puzzling once you are a fan of the idea. But I think part of it, it's it's probably not that easy to do. As it is not as easy to be customer centric, to really put it off. You to pull it off, you have to be very dedicated about it, and I think the same is true for employees. It's not like you can just say it and then it happens. It can't just be, you do an annual engagement survey and then stuff happens. You have to be really obsessed about employee experience as we are about customer experience. And I think we're still working on getting the word out. I think you and me are trying
Yeah.
really hard, and it seems to be not so easy to do so. Uh,
That's so. Let's just start with that stat that you just gave us, because I do think that's fascinating, and it's fairly early on in the book. You talk about the number of times that employees are mentioned in that context, in the context of earnings calls, for example, versus the number of times that customers are mentioned, and that sits alongside the internal conversations that leaders have when they've got to stand up in front of their own employees, when often they are obviously talking to their employees and telling them theoretically how important they are, but not necessarily living it. It's so fascinating that you put those people in an external facing context and the employees become almost an afterthought. And you mentioned in the book that this is partly kind of zero sum game thinking, right? So go into that in a little bit of detail.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, a lot of the analogies I use in the book is like, employees are the new customers. And I think it helps to think sometimes about like what happens with customer centricity, or how did we get there, what makes it hard, and how to apply this to employee centricity. And one is really this either or thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, back in the days where we are actually investing in, where companies like Amazon, who is not a particularly good example on employees, but when they invested in a customer experience, analysts, investors were like, where's the money that comes out of the margins?
Mm-hmm.
Make more money and don't invest in that experience as much. So this is either or thinking. I think with employees it's the same. If you have a mindset of, workers are only after money, that's why they work, and that's the only way we can make them do more. If we pay them more, that is kind of a zero sum game.
Yeah.
That's a little bit like, I have to pay you more in order to make you do more, and that comes out of my margin, or my bottom line. But that's not how human beings function. Like, money is important, but there's other aspects that affect the employee experience. The same, it would be the same if I would say, customers only care about price, and so the only way to get them is to lower the price. That's of course not ideal, because that would go into the margins that I'm having. But I can actually improve the experience of the customers and make more money, and in the same in this for the organization as well. So it could be really win-win, and I think the same is true for your employees. And I think that's the mindset shift that needs to happen, in for executive to really realize that if you treat your employees better, if the experience of the employees improve, it actually helps the organization as well. So that's why the subtitle of the book is, make your business thrive,
Mm.
putting them first, because it really is about win-win. But it needs a mindset shift in how we think about work, how we think about motivation of workers, and how we think about business strategy. Because part of it is actually to improving the experience, and then we're going to make more money because turnover goes down, innovation goes up, and so on and so forth.
Well, and as you point out, the language is part of this issue. I mean, employees, particularly in that context of earning calls, they're often just referred to as costs. There might be a qualifier associated with the word cost, but basically costs, right? And if you're thinking about your employees as, if you like, financial instruments that you can modify, it's going to change how you consider it.
Yeah.
And what I love is that you point out that we've shifted from a world where leading organizations, were not necessarily terribly customer centric. And many of those organizations made customer centric decisions that on the surface might not seem to make sense financially, but obviously do lead to greater financial success. You have your Zappos example. And I think it feels like it's almost like a two-step dance, right? You have to demonstrate that the decisions that organizations have made to be customer centric to very great success in many cases can be mirrored by how they approach employee centricity. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like let me give you an example. When you go to a marketing executive and say to him or her, is it a good idea to ask your customer once a year how they're doing? They would laugh their asses off. There's like, no, of course not. We need like customer insights. We need to listen what they need and constantly update. We need ethnographies to figure out how they're doing. And listening and co-creating with the customer, kind of that experience is a really important part of customer experience and customer centricity. But a lot of organizations do exactly that when it comes to employees. They're not listening. They do like those annual engagement surveys, which everybody knows that it's being ignored. So nobody fills them out in the first place. And indeed, they will be ignored. And so I think that shift has to happen, that we really care about the experience, listening and co-creating with our workforce to doing so. And I'm sure, in your work, you see that constantly.
Yeah.
If you tell, should we listen to our employees? There is nobody who said like, no, we should not. But to actually do it and to actually care and to actually have processes in place where we include the employees, that's a very, very different step where, I have like a bunch of executives they have like full staff meetings and like on-sites, and then there is the Q&A portion and there is no Q in those Q&A portion. Now, there's two options for that. Either there is really no question, or they are not safe enough to ask a question, or think like it doesn't matter anyway because it will be ignored. And in my experience, it's often the latter. There are a lot of questions, that they are actually a lot of inputs that the employees in the workforce want to give, but they're just not listened to, because people are not actually serious when they say we should listen to our workforce to improve.
It's absolutely a leadership issue. And we have a term that we use sometimes called SLINO. And SLINO stands for servant leader in name only, because it implies that they know in some way, shape, or form that there needs to be some form of employee centricity. They've read a book on servant leadership, maybe, or they've heard the term or something along those lines. So they position themselves as one, but when it actually comes to decision making, they don't.
So Paul, I sometimes like the exercise of, let's take a customer-centric sentence and exchange customer with employees. So let me give you an example. So Jeff Bezos once said, what is great about my customers, they're very dissatisfied constantly, even if they're happy. And because we can then change, we can learn something new and can improve. Now, exchange customer there, and as I like, what is great about my employees is they're always dissatisfied, even if they seem to be happy. Now, there is nobody who would say that, but that's exactly the notion you should have in place, where you think like, no, I can constantly learn how to do better on small basis. And we kind of knew that for a long time. The Toyota way of production was kind of that. We listened to, or Toyota did, listen to the frontline workers, on those assembly lines. And if they saw a small problem, they had the power to stop the assembly line, to fix the problem. And we knew how that worked. It worked like you pull that end on cord, you stop the assembly line, then we will fix it. Now you can actually, GM knew about this. So Toyota taught them about this, and they're like, oh, we should do that. And they installed end-on cord on all the assembly lines, but nobody pulled the cord because you have to actually take it seriously. You need to change how you approach this. You need to give people training about this. You need to be aware that it's a risky choice. Stopping the assembly line is very costly. So you need to also be forgiving if somebody pulls the end on cord and it was not worth stopping the assembly line. But in the spirit, you want to get improvements from everybody in the organization, independent of rank. And that's kind of what we should do with employees. And I'm sure that's a lot of the work you have to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
You're figuring out how to actually create, how to listen, how to implement, and how to change the experience as a result.
Well, Stefan, I love this because it actually points to an opportunity. We often talk about the Gallup figures around employee engagement that show sort of levels of around 30%. You actually talk about how internationally some of the figures are even worse, in quotes, worse than that. But you give us an opportunity to rethink that, right? We can, if we adopt that lens that you were talking about, the sort of Amazon lens, but applied to the employee. Think of the huge opportunity to bring employees in to the picture of solving that problem, right? How do we collectively create an environment where employee engagement is higher and invite them to be part of the solution, not just articulating the problem once a year in a survey that doesn't get listened to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But I think, to your very early question, what is so hard about this?
Yeah.
Everybody says what, and I think there are a bunch of stuff that is hard about it. It's like, one is the listening part, which is not so easy.
Mm-hmm.
To actually actively listen, you really care about what they have to say. Then it needs to change also others. You have to be very transparent. Also, what happens in the organization. If you're like down in the organization and they ask you, Paul, how should we change? You need to have some transparency what's happening in the organization at large. If you're secretive about the strategy and don't involve people in the first place, it's very difficult to come up with ideas that are meaningful. And then I think you need to change organizational structure, flatten the organization to make sure that people feel psychologically safe to actually share those information, that it doesn't have any precaution, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to change a bunch of stuff in order to make sure that we not only listen, but the feedback we're getting is actually being implemented in a way that really improves the employee experience.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get into some of the specifics of that as we go through our discussion here. But before we do, I want to kind of as I was reading the book, I was thinking about the 3 objections that we get from CEOs when we talk about this kind of work, and we've already covered one of them, 2 of them, I'd say. So one of them is sort of like the zero-sum nature of this, right? I can't be customer-centric and employee-centric, and I think we both agree that that's absolutely not true, and can give examples as to why. The second is that it's hard, right? And so we'll get into some of to some of that as well. But then the third objection that we hear quite a bit is, this is a luxury I cannot afford. And in other words, it's all very well for companies that are doing really well to focus on this kind of stuff because they've got a lot of money and they can use it for this purpose. But I'm not doing really well, and I'm worried about the future and all this kind of stuff. And that's why I love the Best Buy example. So it's such a great example of how you can actually use employee centricity to improve the fortunes of an organization that's not necessarily doing well, or at least where the outlook for that organization is not that strong. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Best Buy is a really great example, and I think Hubert Charley, who was then the CEO at that point who led this turnaround, was really instrumental in doing so. And he got the advice when he took over that we often hear too often, like, oh, if you really want to improve, you have to improve the cost structure. Now, how do you do that? You fire people, you squeeze out more of your employees and whatever. And he decided not to do that. Now, it was taking over Best Buy at that point was a risky proposition. Like
Yeah.
all the other competitors, Circus City and all those went, got killed by Amazon, and I think many expected the same happening for Best Buy, but he really doubled down on like being employee centric. He did a couple of things in doing so. So first, he like actually did a listening tour. He worked in a store and then to try to understand what really goes wrong in the organization. What are like stupid rules? What are bureaucracies? What are benefits that got cut that are really beneficial to the employees? Now, one benefit he saw that were cut is they actually had those uh, opportunities for store employees to buy, gadgets. Now, if you think about what's the ideal employee who works in Best Buy, somebody who's crazy about gadgets. That's what you want for somebody to have, and they had those benefits for those to do that. And so he reinstated them. He really helped his employee, double down on the employee, and made an amazing turnaround, which also happened to be customer centric. He also cared about like what the customer experience is, and so forth. And I like this example as well, Paul, for the same reason I think that you do. This is a company that struggles. The margins are relatively small. This is not a tech company who like can throw money out the window and build slides in the offices and give free snacks and whatever. And there are a couple of other examples where this actually happened. There's some retailers, Costco being another example. The Texan HEB is another one, which are like extremely employee centric in an industry that is not like a high margin business. It's a relatively low margin business. It's not like money, where profits are growing on their trees within the country and in their company, and they're able to pull it off. And I think that's important to realize. It's really not about you can afford it, because that sounds a little bit like a perk that you're just throwing, perks at your employees. It's really how to improve the experience of your employees, and that isn't often not that you give them, nap pots and free snacks and free yoga classes, because nobody is being motivated by like, oh, there is free snack, let's work a little harder, or I'm not joining a company because they don't have a ping pong table. And I think it's very different aspects that actually improve the experience. Most need attention, but do they need a lot of money? Not necessarily, because it's really about improving the experience that the employees have.
Yeah, the only bone I had to pick with you in the book is you seem to have it in for ping pong tables. I love ping pong tables. I love ping pong, but I know that's a personal thing.
Yeah, I mean, no, Paul, I have nothing against ping pong tables, but like there is one thing you also said before. Like the second thing is like some executives don't want to do it because it's hard.
Yes.
Now, hard is actually important. Hard is if it's easy, everybody would do it.
Yes,
let's say
critical point.
Let's say ping pong table are really the kicker. If you have a ping pong table, like your innovation goes through the roof. Now, of course, everybody gets a ping pong table. That's like an investment of like $500. If you have like for $2,000, you get an amazing professional ping pong table. But so there wouldn't be no differentiation whatsoever. Now, I like ping pong tables as well, but I do think ping pong table in and in itself are not creating the employee experience. You can have ping pong table and a terrible, terrible work culture, and the ping pong table is not going to save. Nobody's going to stay. Oh, my boss is an asshole, but like we have a ping pong table, and so that's not going to work really. So I think you have to
shoot.
I think, Paul, you're out of luck if you think. I know you know better, because I'm sure with your clients, you're not saying, look, if you get a ping pong table, you're all set.
Yeah, that is correct. All right. And actually, let's use that as an opportunity to delve into some of the more complicated aspects of this. And I want to start here with the mission and the vision of the organization. And I find this stuff fascinating for a couple of reasons. And I'll just explain quickly what we've observed in our work. So we found that mission and vision can be very important, and along the lines with what you've seen in your work, that it is really important if it is truly resonant. And there's a second aspect to it as well, though, which is that if you do that work in isolation, it might be more than just ineffective. It might be counterproductive. There's a lot of things that can cause employees to sour on companies. You talk about fairness a lot. Another thing that is kind of related to it is hypocrisy. And so we see quite a lot inside some of the organizations that we've consulted with, where the perception of the employee is negatively impacted by their mission and vision because they see each day their managers not living up to that, or they see their colleagues not living up to that and there being no consequences, or they see even the senior leadership inside the organization not living up to it. So I'd love to get your take on that. I'd love to get your point of view on what needs to happen to ensure that the organization does A, have the mission and vision that resonates, and B, that they do the hard work to make sure that that is lived out in the decisions that are being made every day.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more, Paul. I mean, I call it in the book purpose washing.
Yes. I love that term.
And it's similar to greenwashing, where it borrows it. And then greenwashing, being I pretend to be green, but I'm not really. And once the customer or the regulator find out, there's really a backlash. Now, within the organization, as you said, employees know. They live it every single day. They have inside information, whether the purpose is lived or not. Now, I think, Lee, you're absolutely right. I think there are a couple of problems with purpose. One is that sometimes we mix it up with let's have just a statement that we can put in the break room on the wall, and it sounds kind of cool. One of our brand consultant, whatever, came up with the term, and has no impact whatsoever. Now that, of course, is not motivating at all. If I don't feel it in my daily work and how I'm doing it, so the purpose might be too broad, the mission might be too vague. It has nothing resemblance to what we're actually doing. The second problem is we might not living it. That's what you're talking about, purpose washing. That we're saying we're whatever, we're very ethical and we're not, or we care about people and we're not, and so on. And people inside really feel it. And I think the third problem is sometimes you can only feel it if you actually feel it in your daily task. That's why I use in the book kind of that, in NASA, that janitor says, I'm not mopping the floor, I'm bringing a man to the moon. Well, he actually feels, the purpose that bring a man to the moon at that point in NASA, while he's doing something which is, somehow distant from that mission, but he feels that he's really part of that organization. And creating this is hard. Again, you have to have the right mission, you have to live the mission, and everybody on the organization needs to feel it in their bones and when they're doing their daily task. And that's something that is really hard to do and requires a very intentional work. I'm guessing you're working on those with them to actually bring this to life, but it's really difficult. I mean, we see it in our daily life. If I say, Paul, think about, be grateful that, I don't know, that you can walk to work.
Yeah.
Now, you might be, but you need to feel it yourself. I can't tell you what that is. That might not be the one that you're grateful for. You need to feel it yourself in your bone. And so that makes it hard, really difficult to do, and to make it really impactful. But once you get it right, it can be something that is extremely motivating for for people to do. Um, yeah, I
Yeah,
sometimes make the example of like, if you think about myself, like what do I feel like is a good mission? Like, working in a children's hospital,
mm,
it feels like something that is impactful. Um, and I could see myself like joining an organization that like, we're helping children get healthier. Now, it's possible that in the organization on a daily basis, it sucks.
yeah,
The organization might be very dysfunctional. And then the purpose, it still may, then it sucks. Well, I care about the mission. I can understand that that's important. But like in a daily basis, I deal with like bosses that are terrible. I feel like that I'm not making progress in my career and so on and so forth. And you have to kind of do a lot of those other aspects to make it work. Purpose in and in itself, even if you do it right, is probably not enough to get a motivated workforce. Is that your experience as well? Like how?
it is. I'll say a couple of things on this. One, we absolutely see that there's the theoretical idea of purpose, and it fails almost every time when it's been created by the marketing department, or it's been created with a view to minimizing risk, or it's been created with the sole view of how would I like my shareholders to perceive us, or the general public to perceive us, or our customers to perceive us, right? When you do it that way, one of the most important motivating factors behind defining your purpose is to create some form of passion, and all that passion is lost, basically. So the moon one was kind of like, in a sense, right? It was kind of easy for people who worked at NASA to get behind that as a purpose. But you could imagine a scenario where even that had been framed in such a dry way that it didn't create that, right?
Right.
It could have been like,
Absolutely.
we're going to it could have been very detail driven. It could have been like, okay, we're gonna send craft X number of miles further out from the Earth, or something along those lines, and then you would lose it all. So there is that aspect. There's that aspect. Another aspect that we've seen associated with it, though, is that throughout the organization, you have to, as to your point, people have to be able to connect it to what they do. And if they can't connect it to what they do, then effectively the importance of it disappears. And I've seen in organizations where it is on the wall, but even up to the highest level inside the organization, you don't hear the CEO talking about what the company does in terms of what the mission and the vision of the company is. And in really well run organizations, it's used as almost like a decision, a thing
Right.
that guides decisions. You'll get the awkward question, maybe even in a shareholder call or something like that. And the CEO goes, no, we don't do that because it doesn't align with our mission and vision. And so these things are extremely important. And it constitutes the hard work that you're describing.
Yeah, I like that as well that you said, Paul. Like that. If it if it's a north star, it actually needs to be a guiding principle
Yeah.
that creates what we do and what we don't do. It's a little bit like strategy. If the
Mm-hmm.
strategy is we just want to grow, that doesn't okay. Then everything goes. Uh, but or we want to be, the best company, whatever. That doesn't help us with in the guiding principle, but it creates exactly, we're not doing that because it's not aligned, or we're only doing that because it's aligned with the mission and the purpose we're having. And then it's a decision tool, as much as like a purpose that helps to create meaning for everybody in the organization, from the top to the very bottom, in the
Well,
org
and well
structure.
done. It actually helps with another problem that you kind of isolate, which is the idea that I think of it almost as like your version of the good to great thing of get the right people on the
Hmm.
bus. You're
Yeah.
getting the right people on the bus is sort of like everybody inside the organization. But if you are really clear about how you define what the purpose of the company is, the people who really strongly align with that will start to self-select into it, and people for whom that doesn't resonate will self-select out of that. And that's what you want. You want a group of employees who feel that the company is living and breathing its purpose and feel that they are aligned with that purpose.
Hmm.
And it's then used to help determine not just the quarterly discussion you have with your manager, but the prioritization decisions you're making on a day-to-day basis. A really healthy culture, the employee will say to their manager, should I do A or should I do B? And the manager's like, well, looks to me like B is more aligned to to our
Right.
purpose, so we should be doing
Right.
that. And it
Right.
becomes
Right.
super powerful as a result, right?
Yeah, 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 absolutely. No, I think like it's very, very important to have like some bites in like, decisions, selection, and then that creates kind of the alignment in activities, but also like the right cultural fit of the people who actually work there. And you have some people who do not work there, which is fine.
Yeah.
That's the same with customers as well. You segment, you want certain customers, you don't, you figure that out. And I think the same is true for your employees. And I think I there is the story I tell in the book about KPMG, who
Mm-hmm.
did like this purpose. This is the accounting firms, and I'm not sure everybody would think about accounting first about like their amazing mission that they're having. So KPMG decided to have, they called it 10,000 story challenge, and the idea was like I think in June of that year they decided if by Thanksgiving we have 10,000 stories of individuals, employees, tell what's the purpose, what are they doing that is beyond just doing the numbers. They made an example, one of example, like KPMG was involved in when apartheid ended in South Africa, and they helped with the election, or at least with the monitoring of the election that eventually led to President Mandela being elected. And so they made a poster of that. So they wanted like 10,000
Mm-hmm.
of those stories. By July, and they gave an incentive. So like, if we get 10,000 by Thanksgiving, everybody gets 2 days off. And that's really about everybody has to individually express what does it mean to them? What's their
Yeah.
purpose in life? By July, they already had 10,000. So they started in June. By Thanksgiving, they had 42,000 stories. Uh, and it turns out then that led to an increase in engagement that they have. They increased about 16%, 16 ranks in the best places to work
Mm.
aspect. It has many, many aspects of motivation that improved, and so on and so forth. In particular, when the managers actually talk to people about their purpose. When purpose became a discussion point where as my manager would ask me, so Stephan, what is your purpose? What is your story? How do you feel about that? And that then created those discussions within the organization that brought the purpose really to life, made it very personal about themselves, and created kind of that shared understanding of how we understand purpose, what guiding principle is going to be for all the decisions that we're going to make as employees of in that part, in that case KPMG.
Yeah, the example's great because it talks again about one of these companies where you wouldn't necessarily associate the organization with an exciting purpose that could get people motivated. But as you point out, right, it a really inspiring purpose can come from a bunch of interesting sources and a bunch of interesting organizations that don't look like they would have that on the surface. I'd encourage folks, if they haven't already, to go back and listen to my interview with Gary Ridge, which is a couple of episodes ago, I think, on the pod. Gary's the chairman emeritus of the WD-40 company and was the CEO there for about a decade. Very similar situation where they were collecting, stories of people's experiences of using it. And you start looking at that and you think, well, they just make lubricant. What's that about? Etc. But you think about all of the memories that people create associated with it, and you create something that is very different and critically becomes a driving force behind the activities that people perform in the company. Now, I'm gonna shift gears a bit. It would be criminal, Stephan, criminal if I had one of the leading behavioral economists in the world here, and we didn't talk at all really about economics here. So, so I think what is really interesting is when you start to talk about the motivating factors that employees that actually do keep employees engaged and are associated not just with them showing up for work each day, but measurable improved productivity. And I think many people, probably not many people who listen to this podcast every week, but many people on the surface might think this is pretty simple, right? We do what Henry Ford did. We just pay people more, or we do what Costco is doing. We just pay people more than our competitors. And you point out that that's an element, but it is not the full picture. So throw your behavioral economist hat on and convince us as to what else is important here.
Exactly. It's a little harder initially because that's what I was trained for.
Of course,
models of economics is like, oh, work sucks. It's a bad. So we're only doing it if we get compensated by money or we get controlled. Otherwise, we would slack off and not do anything. Don't show up for work. Now, that's a simple model, which is just unfortunately not true. It would be much easier if it's all about, if we just have to figure out the right compensation plan and then we're good to go.
But you guys made economics really difficult.
Yeah, exactly. So it was easy when it was like, I have to control you and pay you right, and then you're done.
Yeah.
Now, it just turns out, like, obviously income matters for people, especially in the lower end of the income distribution. Yeah. If you feel, not financially stable, if you're worried about making ends meet, that's a killer to productivity because you're not mentally there because you have to worry about like, oh, hopefully I can pay my kids' school fees or my dental expenses and so on and so forth. But once you reach a certain level of income, money is just not a big driver of what motivates people. It's many more other aspects of work, and there's study after study which just show the diminishing return on like making more money. Now, you often hear, I talk to this executive constantly, and they like, oh, I agree, but I just had that one guy, or like those two guys, or like kids these days, or whatever the term is, where they say like, but I just had one. He literally or she quit the job for like $5,000 more. And then I say, well, was it just the money? Yeah, totally the money. We're an amazing company. It's like, and then if you drill a little deeper, turns out that there are other aspects that were not as ideal. They didn't make any, maybe the purpose wasn't that great. Maybe they didn't learn something new. Maybe their relation to culture was not as ideal. And study after study shows like there are very few who switch just for money. They stay if they're really happy and motivated. And I think those are the factors where we really can make a difference. Paying money is also kind of a zero-sum game in competition. It's a little bit like, again, going back to the customer, if we were all price, we would just like lower the prices one after another, and it would be a race to the bottom. If it were just money, and we know from customer, they care about more stuff than price. And I think that's the same for the employees. And now, the behavioral science and the behavioral economics tells us what people are motivated beyond money.
So, Stephan, in our work, we've seen a strong correlation between employee engagement and the ability to learn and grow. even in situations where organizations might not think it's necessarily that important, or they've just provided learning and development opportunities through course catalogs and things like that. Um, you talk about that being a factor, right? It's not so. Yes, there is the factor as to how are you in a toxic environment, are you in a healthy, supportive environment, but also that there is importance for employees to be able to actually grow themselves while they're in their current job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like Paul, this is one of the more important one. I mean, they're all the four I talked about
Yeah.
were important, but this is an important one. I think the stats are about 40% of people say their number one reason why they quit is because they don't learn anything new.
Wow.
And about only a quarter, I think, of employees report that they're encouraged to learn something new. And that comes a little bit from the third stats that I'm going to say about 80% of employees report talent hoarding, meaning their manager, their boss actually doesn't want them to learn something new because then they potentially leave. Think about like, I work for you, I'm really good at what you're doing, and you're thinking, Paul, think like, Stephan, like I really like what he's doing in that particular job. I don't want him to learn something new because otherwise you might leave, and I don't want him to leave. So you hoard the most important talent, and I think it's a very, very important human motivators that we want our skills to be optimally utilized and constantly improve. It's like if we have a job that is stupid, that's demotivating. It's too easy. I do it like it's boring as hell. The same is true when we have a task that we're not properly trained or we don't have help and don't get better in doing so. That's also frustrating. We don't feel good about this when we constantly fail. And so we want to learn something new and get better at it all the time. Now there are those traditional like learning and development things, which I think are okay. But there is other aspects. Mentoring is one of them. How do we actually learn from other people? How do we learn as a group? How do you help me getting better? And it's important to facilitate an environment where those mentoring and peer learning happens. Now, it's hard. I call this just right tasks in the book, where you have to just right task. And I sometimes talk to exec. I mean, I just had a session on this this afternoon, where I then told executive, you just need to know for all your employees what's the just right tasks. What's the task that optimally stimulates them, and match them to the right tasks, and constantly update. And then they look at me as if I have like 7 heads. It's like, how difficult that is, Stephan? I have like 50 employees or 20, even if you have only 10.
Yeah.
That's hard to do. But we need a mechanism in place. Now, technology actually can help us do that better because it sounds a little bit like an AI task. It sounds a little bit like what Netflix is doing in figuring out. So Paul really likes, look at your book. He really likes like, British crime, like Sherlock Holmes type of series. So it shows Netflix shows you more of those crime drama. It knows, Paul really likes that. I'm more of a nature documentary kind of guy. So it shows me more nature documentaries. Now, eventually we'll be bored with all the British, whatever, slow horses and like, and all that type of stuff. So and Netflix then figure out, Paul now really wants something else. So shows you new stuff. So that's what algorithm do. And I think we can apply that now to those, those learning opportunities. And I think internal marketplaces, AI-powered internal marketplaces actually do exactly that. So MasterCard is an organization that I just wrote a case about that uses those internal marketplaces where like employees go to the platforms and I want to learn something new. I want to get a stretch assignment as we called it in the past. I want to work for a couple of times somewhere else. And then it matches it to opportunities within MasterCard where people then work, beside their job on the side, a little bit on another project. The database now, the data, that it collects now gives me then better and better matches over time. And as a result, people learn, get engaged, and they also don't leave the organization. They stay within MasterCard. MasterCard did that. It started during the pandemic, and they have now 5 years later, they're unlocked. That's the name of their platform.
Mm-hmm.
Unlocked 1 million work hours, where like people 1 million hours where people will work on those other projects, and as a result, to your point about growing and learning, they learn. They now applied this. They figured out, well, maybe that works with mentoring as well. And yes, it does. So they now use that platform also to match, find the right mentor, mentee, get the right match, constantly learn on the go as an algorithm. So part of the learning is not only working on different projects, getting the right mentors, learning, peer learning as well. And so I think it's a powerful example where you can use AI and technology to actually enhance the motivators here, the competence or the just right tasks that I call it. And you're absolutely right. It's a very, very important motivator that keeps people engaged, motivated, and productive in their job.
Yeah, and it's not just job-specific skills either. I mean, some of these are intangible skills,
Uh,
like even social skills. I was fascinated by something you mentioned in the book about how um, social skills and things that we often collect together under the banner EQ these days could actually make teams smarter. So talk to people about that. Like it's like you add up. I mean, in theory, like in your head, you just add up all the IQ points of all the individuals, and that's the IQ of the team. But you point out
yes,
something different,
exactly.
right?
So yes, it's like they call it their collective intelligence. So if you think
Yeah.
about IQ, which is an individual measure of like how smart we are, and there it's like in an IQ test, I give you kind of bunch of tasks,
Mm-hmm.
and then see, oh, you're doing well on this one, you're doing a little less well on this one, but in aggregate, you're doing, some are doing better than others. So they did the same with teams. And it turns out some teams are better than others. So there is something like collective intelligence. But then, exactly to your point, then it's like, well, can we just add up how smart the individuals are? And no, we cannot. There's something, a magic ingredients that makes certain teams better than others. So the researchers then were like, what is it? What is it that actually creates better, smarter than less smart teams if it's not the IQs of the individual members? And it turns out like empathy, or social
Mm-hmm.
skills is a really, really important part of what makes a group better than the individual. It's a little bit like when Michael Jordan said, talent win games, and the right teams win trophies.
Yeah.
It's like, what is it that creates a great team? And in those research, they really showed that like social skills, empathy is a really, really important ingredient in making individuals that are smart even smarter collectively. And I love those studies as well. And it's really fascinating to think about, how can we apply this to our work teams? Because like we're often hire for like, just individual skills. We hire like, you're smarter than the other applicants, so then I pick you. Um, but we forget that there is another ingredient that actually makes in working together, makes working together really work. And it's those social skills that create then from talent really teams that do win trophies, or like are high performing teams in organizations.
All right, Stefan, we could be talking about this stuff forever, but I mean, certainly a few days. But our podcast has a time limit, so I'm gonna finish up here, and I want to talk about this whole rise of AI and robotics and automation, and how this is changing attitudes and how potentially it should change attitudes. Um, I will tell you that in our work, what we've seen is that there are kind of two things going on at the same time, right? The rise of these capabilities, and particularly, obviously, the thing that people are most focused on because they most people see more of it on a day to day basis is generative AI. But this whole idea of like AI and robotics and automation, some people are excited about what it does for them on a day to day basis, but most people, once you dive a little deeper, have some level of fear associated with it, right? Because I mean, frankly, it's probably logical to have an element of fear because there's uncertainty in terms of the degree to which it's going to replace some of the capabilities that we've spent years honing. Um, but as it's creating that level of fear and uncertainty and doubt in employees, we found that it's also confusing many of the leaders that we speak to. And I'll tell you that we've had conversations with CEOs who are hesitating to invest in employee centricity or employee centric initiatives because, and I'll quote but won't name a CEO who said they're not sure whether the employees are going to be around to benefit in the investment that they're making in them. Now, I'm guessing you think that's a mistake um, in terms of the approach that some of these leaders are thinking of this as. But do you think that creating a great employee experience is still going to be a significant differentiator as the rise of the machines occurs, as it were?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're right in assuming that I would disagree with what those CEOs was saying. In fact, I think it's exactly the opposite,
Mm-hmm.
where like you actually have to be employee centric to get the benefits of AI. Let me give you a couple of thoughts about this. So one is I have a great quote from the head of AI at Morgan Stanley, who said about my book, it has nothing to do about AI, but it has everything to do with AI because
Yeah.
the future of work is really about human-centric approach. Now, why do I think that? I think like if you think about a couple of things, like one is adoption of AI. In order to get AI adopted, you have to be employee-centric. I actually just finished the survey that is not in the book, but not yet because I literally just finished it with the Boston Consulting Group, where we measure AI centricity and employee centricity and AI adoption. And it turns out there is like a huge positive correlation between employee centricity and AI adoption. In fact, those companies who are employee centric are 7 times more likely to be AI mature in the adoption because you need the employees to actually get AI off the ground. I'm very, very suspicious of like those, we're going to be organizations without any employees soon. What I'm almost certain is that every human will work with a machine. So
Mm-hmm.
human machine interaction is going to be really, really important. But in order to do that, we need to understand what actually makes human tick. How can we augment human beings and how can we create more value with machines and humans together? So I think it's critically important that we invest in employee centricity. So let's think about one aspect of empathy. We talked about listening at the very beginning. We started about like how to get inputs. I think that's very, very important to get the AI systems the right in place, to make them adopt, to actually construct them in a way that are productive. We need to understand what the problem is that the employees are facing, and how can we use AI to support them. And I think without that listening aspect, we are not getting it off the ground. I mean, it's just very, very difficult. So I think exactly the opposite. Like we actually need to be employee centric in order to get the benefits of AI, get the adoption right, and get the human machine interaction right. So that same head of AI, Jeff McMillan,
Mm-hmm.
at Morgan Stanley said, and I love this quote, and I say it every time somebody asks. He said, "Tech is easy, humans are hard."
Yeah.
The tech part. I mean, that's actually not that hard, but the human beings. are not that easy. We need to understand what motivates them, what your work is all about, like figuring out like what makes them tick. How can we actually get them on board? How can we get the benefit of the technology with the human beings together? So no, employee centricity is not going out of style. In fact, quite the opposite. I think we need to be more employee centric to get the benefit of the technology as well.
Wonderful. We will leave it on that point of very strong agreement, Stephan. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Paul, for having me. This was great. Fantastic.